All right, so how should you be approaching running backs this year? And this position is a little bit more interesting than quarterbacks because quarterbacks, it's just a one-off position, right? There's only so many ways you can look at it. Running back, there's a lot of ways that you could go. And you've heard some of the names, I'm sure, the zero RB approach. It wasn't that long ago people were taking a ton of running backs at the top of their drafts. That doesn't happen as much anymore. And it's for a variety of reasons. Running backs tend to get hurt. Receivers have a lot of value if you can get those elite guys. But one of the strategies that I really like and that I've been employing mostly for the last few years, and I will say I'm not going in with a set plan. I'm willing to use all these, but the one that I tend to use the most, you can call it hero RB, you can call it anchor RB, but it's getting one running back in the early rounds. You get your RB1, you get that guy solidified in your lineup, then you address all the other positions in your lineup that aren't running back. You go get a couple elite receivers. You go get yourself a quality quarterback and an elite tight end. And then you come back around to running back in the 6th, 7th, 8th round. And if you want to know some of the names that we're talking about here, in the first couple rounds, I'm looking at Christian McCaffrey, of course, Bijan Robinson, Breece Hall, Jonathan Taylor, Saquon Barkley, Kyron Williams, Devon Achane. We're going to talk about some of these guys in a second. Those are the players in the first couple rounds that I want to take, that I'm confident either that they're going to get a ton of volume or that they just have that massive fantasy ceiling because they're such explosive and dynamic players. Then there's another pocket, and this is going to depend on what kind of drafts you're in. Best ball is going to be different than your home leagues. If you're more casual fantasy players, maybe we'll see some of these guys fall in ADP or potentially rise even. But there's another pocket sort of at the end of the 3rd into the 4th round where I'm a little bit intrigued. That's Isaiah Pacheco, Josh Jacobs, and a guy who's been moving up in my rankings, Kenneth Walker on the Seahawks. And I know Josh Jacobs, I'm sure Wilkins wants to chime in here. He's our resident Raiders fan. He loves Josh Jacobs from his days with Vegas. And Jacobs is somebody that legitimately is a value now that he's gone over to the Packers. That is a great young offense. Going to be a lot of scoring opportunity. And we have Marshawn Lloyd a little bit banged up right now. That means Jacobs could start the season really hot. Then we look at a few rounds later, when I talked about the 6th, 7th, 8th round, there are so many of these veteran backs that have maybe a red flag here or there. Guys like James Conner, people are worried about the durability issues. He gets pushed down. Ramondre Stevenson, he's on that Patriots offense. I know a lot of people don't think they're good, but they can't get any worse than they've been the last few years. He's going to have a chance at a pretty good fantasy season. We also look at guys like Javonte Williams, who's kind of on the rise. He's coming back from an injury that he had a couple years ago. Now he's getting back to form, and because of that injury, he was pushed so far down in ADP. He's a great value. And then a rookie in Jonathan Brooks. Jonathan Brooks is a 3-down back. He is somebody who's going to be fantastic for fantasy. You're just going to have to wait. It's delayed gratification. You're going to have to wait until the second month or maybe even the second half of the season before you get him out there and producing for your lineup. But I'm sure that you're going to be happy that he's on your team when we get to that point in the season. Now, after that, you look at some of the ambiguous backfields. You get to the 8th, 9th, 10th round. Guys like Tajay Spears, Tony Pollard on the Titans. We talked about them on last week's show. Either of those guys could give you decent flex value, potentially RB2 numbers for fantasy. It's going to be a hot hand approach in that backfield. I'm not going to go over it again. We talked about it last week. And I know Tajay Spears Wilkins always going back to Dan Wilkins' NFL draft analysis, our resident NFL draft expert. He crushes all of our content around the NFL draft every year. He was huge on Tajay Spears last year. Tajay Spears compared him to
LaShawn
McCoy. Love that comparison. Of course, LaShawn McCoy, former Bill, gonna love that one. But Spears is somebody that could really break out this year, and we'll talk a little bit more about him in a second. A Chase Brown in that range. Brian Robinson in that range. Don't know why people are sleeping on him. Brian Robinson is the starter in that Commanders offense. Austin Eckler, big name. He is going to be the second back on that team. So there are a lot of backs in that range that you could target as your potential RB2 or as a guy that you could put in your flex, and then maybe they will emerge as an RB2 for you later in the season. And then when we get to the late rounds, that's when I want to just focus on running backs, because we know, guys, how many times has it happened for you that you have these backup running backs on your roster, or you pick up a guy on the waiver wire, and all of a sudden an injury happens halfway through the season, and that guy becomes the starter, and he helps you get to the fantasy playoffs, and maybe even a fantasy championship. And when we look at that range, you want to talk about the guys that we know for sure are the backup, the Zach Charbonnets, the Trey Bensons of the world. Like, there's so many guys, Ty Chandler, those are the guys that you want to target when we get to those later rounds. And depending how deep your draft is, you want to continue to go after running backs all the way through. And that's why we're watching these number 2 running back battles during the preseason, because you can find a lot of value. Earlier in the show, I brought up the Jordan Mason thing, right? He's somebody that goes at the very end of fantasy drafts right now, but he could turn out to be the number 2 back in that Kyle Shanahan rushing attack, where CMC is going into the season potentially a little bit banged up. Not too worried about it right now, but that could be the situation for Jordan Mason. So strategy-wise, that's how I'm approaching it. You go after that one running back early, and then you wait and you try to find value at one of those other pockets I mentioned. For me, normally that comes in like the 6th, 7th, 8th round when I'm going to target my second back. And that's because you've had so much time to fill out the rest of your lineup with those other elite players at the positions that aren't running back. Now, we're going to move on here. We're going to talk about some breakouts, some busts. That's what you want to know, right? Who should I be targeting? Who should I be avoiding? Let's do breakouts first. And the first guy I'm going to talk about, Devon Achane, this is low-hanging fruit. We did this last week when we talked about quarterback breakouts. I want to make sure that we're casting a wide net because there's a lot of people coming back to the fantasy community right now. You haven't paid attention all off-season long, and we want to make sure you know about these guys that could potentially win your league for you. And Devon Achane is a guy that flashed immense upside last year. If you just look at the year-end totals, RB24. We don't look at the year-end totals. That's a waste of time. Doesn't account for injuries, doesn't account for games where a guy might be limited or something like that. So we look at the per-game averages. And if you look at what Achane did last year, the RB4 overall in fantasy points per game, he is in a perfect system for him. I mean, Mike McDaniel's rushing attack, you have the speedy running back. As long as he can stay healthy, Raheem Mostert now 32 years old. What's going to happen with him? We don't wish injury on anyone, but Mostert has been shockingly healthy the last couple of years. Is he going to continue it at this phase of his career? And Mostert also scored 18 rushing touchdowns last year. Achane had 8 rushing touchdowns, so it wasn't like he didn't do anything, but maybe we see those numbers switch a little bit. The team has talked about Achane getting more work, so very excited about him, but you do have to pay up to get him in your drafts this year. If we go a little bit deeper, that's when we end up in that range talking about guys that could break out in those ambiguous backfields like Tajay Spears and Chase Brown. And for Tajay Spears, I mean, the guy last season came into the league as a rookie and carved out a legitimate role next to Derrick Henry, who was just that stalwart on the Titans offense. He's not there anymore. They bring in Tony Pollard, but if we saw Spears last year have 838 yards from scrimmage and 52 receptions and 3 touchdowns, and that's playing with Derrick Henry, what could he potentially do alongside Tony Pollard? Could he even take that job over at some point during the season? I think that's certainly possible, and there's very little risk involved where you're taking him in drafts in the 8th round. Now, you go to the other side of things, some of the busts, and I don't want to pick on the older guys at all here, but Aaron Jones, 29 years old right now. He's going to be 30 in December, and I know that because him and I share a birthday. We're not the same age, of course, Jonah, but we share a birthday on December 2nd. Shout out December 2nd, best birthday out there. But he is going to a new team, and when you see some of these older backs go to new teams, that can be a little bit concerning sometimes. Maybe their previous team saw something, a little bit of decline perhaps, and that's why they let that player go. And when you think about Aaron Jones, it might not even be his fault. Sounds like the guy's a great teammate, a great person, and he's been a great player and a great fantasy asset for a long time, but he's dealt with a lot of injuries in the last few years, right? And you could look it up. I mean, it's basically like 2 injuries every single season. It's a knee, it's been a hamstring, and he's missed some time. Now he's going to Minnesota. He's a little bit older. Is he going to be able to keep it going? And we said there's some concerns with that Vikings offense. In my mind, looking at Sam Darnold, are they going to be one of the better attacks in the league this year? I don't think so. So Aaron Jones is someone that I'm worried about because of the age. I'm not really drafting him. The other bust I think this year could be Derrick Henry. And this one always scares me because Derrick Henry's a player that we've been wondering when that age cliff was going to hit for a long time, and it just hasn't come. The guy's a monster, works out harder than anybody out there, but now he's changing teams. He's going to the Ravens, who traditionally have been a great rushing attack. They'll probably always be a great rushing attack for as long as Lamar Jackson's there, but Wilkins talked about it. Some concerns about that offensive line. They have some guys, even the guys they trust in that offensive line, that have durability issues, so is that going to be a problem? And Henry on the wrong side of 30 now. At the same time, he is probably the guy that scares me the most not to draft him. Avoiding Derrick Henry could turn out to be just a terrible move, and the Ravens could crush it this year and Henry could have a fantastic season. But a guy that, because of where he's going, I don't really want to pay up for that older back. And that's sort of a move that I generally go about in fantasy drafts, not wanting to take those older guys that you have to pay up for in the top rounds. Not a big fan of doing that. Now, if we move along to sleeper, you're not going to be surprised about the guy I'm going to mention here. That's Ty Chandler. And that goes to the Aaron Jones situation, right? If Jones is older, if Jones misses time like he has in the last couple seasons, who's going to step in there? Ty Chandler is that guy. And they were talking up Ty Chandler like he could be the number one back for the Vikings before they brought Aaron Jones in. And we know what happened with the Packers. It was kind of a last minute thing where they decided to let Jones go and then he signs in Minnesota. But Ty Chandler looks like he is going to be in some sort of committee and some sort of split in that backfield. Ty Chandler, a very good running back, not an elite player, but a guy that can get it done with volume. We saw last year at 5 games where he had at least 14 touches. 4 of those games, he put up double-digit fantasy points. I think he's a guy that can give you flex value, and if Aaron Jones misses time, potentially up into that RB2 range for you. But we talk about all these different things. What you really want to know, Boone, tell me who is going to help me win my league this year. There are 2 guys that I'm mainly focused on for this. The first, Jonathan Taylor. And this ties into what we talked about last week. We went over Anthony Richardson as a potential breakout at quarterback, going and talking about the Shane Steichen system, that up-tempo offense they have, going to be a ton of opportunity, but there's so much more. The fact that Richardson's going to be healthy this year, the fact that their offensive line has gotten good again. They're returning all 5 starters, one of the best offensive lines in the league. And Jonathan Taylor is a player that we might forget how good he was a couple years ago. I mean, this is a guy that finished as the RB2 overall in fantasy points per game a couple seasons ago. Last year, there was some contract issues, some injury stuff early in the season. He missed some games, and then they kind of eased him in for a couple outings. But once he got back, over the last 12 contests last year, he was the RB3 in fantasy points per game. That tells you the upside that he can offer. He certainly could get back up into the conversation with the top 3 running backs this year. People are looking at it going, it's CMC, it's Breece Hall, it's Bijan Robinson. Don't be surprised if Jonathan Taylor is right up there as well. And the other guy that I try to get in almost every draft that I'm in, and I've been doing this for a couple of years, guys, James Conner with the Cardinals, tying a whole bow on the show here, going back to talking about the Cardinals at the very beginning. James Conner, when he has been healthy, and I understand there are durability concerns, there's concerns with his age too. He's 29 years old. The last couple seasons, he's missed 4 games each year. But when he's been out there, when he's been healthy, if you just isolate the games where he's healthy, where he plays the majority of the snaps, he has put up RB1 stats every single season over the last 3 years since he arrived in Arizona. And this is a guy that you can get sometimes into the 6th round. You have to be targeting James Conner. If you are worried about the durability concerns, go out and get his backup, Trey Benson, who is falling a little bit in drafts right now. You can get him in like the 11th round. So I think those 2 players are going to be on a lot of fantasy league winning teams this year, guys. I hope that you're going to draft them. I hope everybody at home has been taking notes on all this stuff as well. And I hope you guys aren't going to text me like a million times during your drafts and like a million times during the season about all your teams.